The gun was pressed against Abraham Wallace's temple when he said it. Not the words she expected. Not a curse. Not a threat. Not the cold tactical calculation she had come to associate with the man who had ridden into her life 6 weeks ago like a storm nobody had forecast. The man who had watched her with those unreadable gray eyes and kept his distance like proximity itself was a form of danger. The man who had told her, plainly and without apology, that he was there for the land deed and nothing else. The man who had made it abundantly clear that sentiment was a luxury he had stopped affording himself somewhere around the age of 19, when the war took everything soft from him and left behind only iron. The gun belonged to Denton Cross, and Denton Cross was not a patient man. The barn around them smelled of hay and smoke, and the first edges of the fire that had been set deliberately at the eastern wall. Outside, the Nevada desert night was absolute, the stars indifferent, the wind carrying the distant sound of horses that had broken loose from the far paddock. Gertrude Beckett stood 4 feet away with her hands raised and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her jaw, and she was watching Abraham Wallace with an expression she could not have described if someone offered her a week in a dictionary. Because he was not looking at Denton Cross. He was looking at her. And he said, quietly, with the barrel of a Remington Army revolver pressed against the side of his skull, "I did not plan on caring about any of this, and here I am caring deeply." Denton Cross laughed. It was a horrible sound, dry and self-satisfied, the laugh of a man who believed he had already won. "That is real touching, Wallace. You want to die over a woman and a patch of rock that barely grows grass." Abraham did not answer Denton Cross. He kept his gray eyes on Gertrude, steady and certain in a way that made her chest feel like it was splitting open, and he said, lower this time, meant only for her, "Get out of the barn, Gertrude." She did not move. She was not sure she could, because 6 weeks ago she had not known this man existed. 6 weeks ago she had been standing in the post office in Elko, Nevada, reading a letter from a lawyer in Carson City informing her that her uncle Aldous Beckett had died and left her everything he owned, which included a failing cattle ranch, approximately 40 head of longhorn, 2 hired hands who had already quit, $17 in a cracker tin, and a debt that was due in 4 months. 6 weeks ago, she had been a 26-year-old seamstress in the town of Elko with rough hands and precise fingers, and a very clear idea of how her life was going to continue proceeding, which was quietly, and without incident, and certainly without men who looked at her like Abraham Wallace was looking at her right now. 6 weeks ago, she had not known what it felt like to be looked at like that. She knew now, and she was not getting out of this barn without him. The letter from Carson City had arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September of 1874. Gertrude Beckett remembered the date precisely because she had burned herself on the iron that morning, a diagonal stripe across the inside of her left wrist, and she had been pressing a damp cloth against it when the postmaster knocked on the door of her small back room above the laundry and handed her the envelope with an expression that suggested he already knew the contents were going to be complicated. He was correct. The ranch was called the Beckett Flat. It sat 11 miles southeast of the small ranching community of Palisade, Nevada, in a shallow basin that collected morning frost in autumn and brutalized everything it touched with wind from October onward. Gertrude had visited it once when she was 9 years old, and she remembered a thin man with yellow teeth who smelled of saddle leather and tobacco, and who had looked at her with the mild curiosity of someone encountering an interesting rock. Her uncle Aldous had not been a warm man. He had not been a particularly communicative man. The one letter he had ever written her had come in 1869 when she was 21, and had consisted of a single sentence informing her that the price of beef was dropping and that life was hard. She had not expected to inherit anything from him. She had especially not expected to inherit his problems. But the letter from the lawyer, a Mr. Theodore Payne of Carson City, was very specific. The Beckett Flat and all its assets, such as they were now hers. The debt against the property, owed to a man named Denton Cross who operated as a private creditor and occasional land speculator in Elko County, was $2,040. It was due on January the 15th of 1875. If it was not paid, the deed transferred to Cross, and the land was gone. Gertrude read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket. Then she picked up the iron again, because she had 4 shirts to finish before noon, and she stood at the ironing board pressing seams and thinking about $2,040, which was a sum she could not have assembled in 2 years of seamstress work, let alone 4 months. She had arrived at the Beckett flat on the 1st of October with a single trunk, a sewing kit, a .32 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver that had belonged to her father, and no plan whatsoever beyond the vague intention of figuring something out when she got there. What she found was worse than the lawyer's letter had prepared her for. The main house was standing, barely. The roof had lost a significant portion of its eastern shingles, and someone had patched the gap with a piece of canvas that had since begun to rot. The kitchen had mice. The front porch listed severely to the left. The well was functional but produced water that tasted of iron. The barn was the best structure on the property, solid and dry, which was either a tribute to her uncle's priorities or an indictment of them, depending on how one felt about cattle. The cattle themselves, down from 40 to 32 by what she could count, were rangy and thin, and spread across the lower pasture with the dejected air of animals who had long ago stopped expecting anyone to take a particular interest in their welfare. The 2 hands who had quit had apparently taken the good horses with them, because the only horse remaining was an aging sorrel gelding named Edgar, who regarded Gertrude with deep suspicion from the moment she arrived, and maintained it consistently thereafter. She spent the first 3 days at the Beckett flat doing an inventory of what she had, which was depressing, and an inventory of what she needed, which was overwhelming, and trying to calculate whether there was any possible version of events in which she kept this property, paid the debt, and did not end up destitute by February. The mathematics did not cooperate. On the 4th day, she was on the roof attempting to replace shingles when she heard a horse coming up the eastern track, and she shaded her eyes and looked down and saw Abraham Wallace for the first time. He was riding a blue roan mare with a steady, ground-eating walk, and he was wearing a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat, and the kind of expression that suggested he had ridden a long way and was not particularly impressed by the journey. He was perhaps 30 years old, lean and weathered in the way of men who spent most of their time outdoors, with a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days and gray eyes that caught the October light with an unnerving clarity. He stopped at the base of the ladder she had propped against the eave and looked up at her. "You Gertrude Beckett," he said. "I am," she said from the roof. "Who are you?" "Abraham Wallace." He said it like it was information she should already have, which she did not. "I work cattle drives out of Winnemucca most years. Heard this place was in trouble. Heard there might be a proposition." "From who?" He appeared to consider the question. "Lawyer named Payne. Sent word through a mutual acquaintance that the heir to Beckett flat might need an experienced hand and a business arrangement." Gertrude came down the ladder. She stood in the dust in front of him, squinting up slightly because he was taller than he had appeared from the roof, and she looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "What kind of business arrangement?" "Profit sharing. I run your cattle through winter, get them in shape for spring sale, take 20% of whatever the herd brings. You keep the deed. We both walk away with something. You would do that for 20%. I would do that for 20% and the use of the barn to winter my mare," he said, "and 3 meals a day, and I sleep in the bunkhouse." She looked at him for another moment. He looked back at her without any apparent discomfort at being evaluated, which she found interesting. Most men fidgeted under a direct look from a woman. Abraham Wallace simply waited, as though he had all the time in the world and none of it mattered particularly. "You have references," she said. "Hendricks and Sons, Winnemucca. McAllen Cattle, Battle Mountain. Ask either of them if Abraham Wallace can run cattle, she asked. She rode into Palisade the next morning and sent telegrams to both outfits, and by evening she had her answers. Hendricks and Sons said that Wallace was the best trail boss they'd employed in a decade, reliable, tough, and discreet about the things a trail boss needed to be discreet about. McCallan said simply that if she had the sense God gave a fence post, she would take whatever Wallace was offering. She sent him to the bunkhouse and told him they would talk terms in the morning. That had been October the 4th. What she had not fully understood in those first weeks was how thoroughly Abraham Wallace's presence was going to rearrange her understanding of herself. He was not warm. He was efficient. He rose before dawn and worked until dark, and he ate the meals she prepared with focused appreciation and minimal conversation. And he did not make unnecessary demands, and he did not involve himself in her business beyond the cattle, which was, she told herself, exactly what she wanted. The problem was the way he watched her, not inappropriately, not with any particular hunger or presumption. He watched her the way he watched the weather, with a careful analytical attention that was trying to determine what something was going to do next. She would be at the kitchen table working on the accounts, and she would look up and find those gray eyes on her, and then he would look away without embarrassment, as if being caught noticing things was simply an observable fact that required neither apology nor explanation. It was infuriating. It was also, she admitted to herself in the privacy of the night when the wind was working at the canvas patch on the roof, and she was lying awake staring at the ceiling, not entirely unwelcome. She had not been looked at carefully by anyone in a long time. Her parents were gone, her father to a fever when she was 16 and her mother to grief 2 years after. She had no siblings. Her social life in Elko had been civil and pleasant and entirely surface level, the friendships of a woman who was liked but not known, respected but not sought out. She had understood, in some part of herself, that she generally did not examine closely, that she had kept people at a carefully maintained distance for reasons that had to do with the particular way loss felt when it arrived without warning. Abraham Wallace did not ask to be let in. He simply stood at the edge of her carefully maintained distance and watched, and somehow that was more unsettling than any attempt to breach it would have been. The first real conversation happened in the second week. She had ridden out to the south pasture to check the fence line, which had been reported to her by a neighboring rancher as showing several significant gaps, and she found Abraham already there, working a stretch of downed wire back into position with his bare hands and a pair of pliers. She tied Edgar to a post and went to the next section and began working it herself, and they worked in silence for a while, the kind of silence that is companionable rather than awkward, and then she said, without particular premeditation, "Why do you do this?" He did not look up from the wire. "Do what?" "Cattle work, trail driving, this." She gestured at the fence, at the land, at the general landscape of physical difficulty that surrounded them on all sides. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It is simple." "Simple," she repeated. "You know what the work is. You know what is expected. You do the work and either the cattle make it or they do not." He pulled the wire taut and crimped it around the post with the pliers. Most things in life are not that clear, she thought about that. "That sounds like a description of something you are trying to avoid," she said. He did look up then briefly, and the gray eyes had something in them she could not immediately name. Not offense, something more considered than that. "Most people are," he said. She did not press it, but she filed it away. The dark passed. She learned about it gradually, the way you learn about terrain by walking it rather than looking at a map. She learned that he had served in the Union Army from age 17, which meant he had been in it by 1862, and had come out of it at 22 in a condition that he described only as altered. She learned that he had a brother somewhere in Missouri who he had not spoken to in 8 years. She learned that he had been married once, briefly, to a woman in Cheyenne who had died of cholera in the epidemic of 1867, and that he did not speak of her with grief exactly, but with a kind of careful neutrality that was worse than grief. The neutrality of a man who had decided not to let himself feel the full weight of a thing, because the full weight would destroy him. She learned these things slowly, in the margins of working days, in the 10 minutes before supper when he would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, and she would sit in the chair beside him, and they would watch the desert light change on the mountains to the west, and she would ask a question, or he would say something unexpected, and then they would lapse back into silence that felt less like distance every day. She noticed that he repaired things without being asked. The porch, he fixed it on a Tuesday when the cattle were in the near pasture, and the day's work allowed an extra hour. The kitchen window that had been sticking, he planed the frame smooth one evening after supper while she was doing the accounts. Small repairs, executed quietly without comment, as if the house's failings were something he felt personally obligated to address. She did not comment on it directly, but she made sure there was always coffee when he came in from the cold. The third week brought the first real trouble. A man named Carter rode out from Palisade with a letter from Denton Cross. The letter was politely worded and deeply threatening, suggesting that Cross had become aware of improvements being made to the Beckett flat, and wished to clarify that said improvements did not alter the terms of the debt, which remained due in full on January the 15th, and that he hoped Miss Beckett would not labor under any misapprehension about the possibility of extension. Gertrude read the letter twice and then handed it to Abraham, who was leaning against the kitchen doorframe with his coffee cup. He read it once. His expression did not change. He handed it back. "You know Cross?" she asked. "I know of him," Abraham said. "Elko County. Operates as a lender, but what he really is a land collector. He finds properties in trouble, extends credit at terms people cannot refuse when they are desperate, and then calls the debt at the worst possible moment." "That is exactly what he did to my uncle," Gertrude said. "Your uncle probably thought he had more time," Abraham said. "Cross counts on that." "Do you think he expected my uncle to die before the debt was due?" Abraham looked at her steadily. "I think Cross does not much care what happens to the people who owe him money. He cares about the land." Gertrude set the letter on the table and pressed her palms flat against the surface and looked at it. "I'm not losing this land," she said. It was the first time she had said it out loud with that particular quality of certainty. She had thought it, had argued herself toward it in the sleepless hours, had assembled it from the evidence of her own stubbornness, and the strange feeling that this broken-down place was asking something of her that she was obligated to answer. But saying it out loud in front of Abraham Wallace made it a different kind of real. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "All right." Not a reassurance, not a promise, just an acknowledgement that she had said a thing and he had heard it and they were proceeding accordingly. She found she preferred that to reassurance. They worked harder after that. Abraham brought in 2 additional hands from Palisade, young men named Delbert and Roy, reliable if inexperienced, and the 4 of them spent the last days of October and the 1st of November working the cattle hard, improving their condition, repairing the fence lines to keep the herd intact and prevent losses to the desert. Gertrude worked alongside them, more than was strictly necessary, partly because the physical work helped the anxiety, and partly because she was not the kind of person who gave orders and then went inside to wait. Abraham noticed this. She could tell by the way he adjusted, subtly, how he assigned tasks when she was present, making sure she was given work that was useful rather than performative, treating her capability as an established fact rather than a pleasant surprise. She appreciated that more than she could say. November brought the cold. It came down from the north in stages, each stage colder than the last, and the basin that held the Beckett flat collected the frost and held it until noon and sometimes beyond. The cattle grew their winter coats and bunched together in the mornings and steamed in the cold air, and Gertrude found herself spending more time in the barn than in the house, because the barn was warmer, and also because Abraham tended to be in the barn. This was a thing she recognized and did not entirely admit to herself. There was an evening in the second week of November when she came into the barn to check on a cow that had been limping, and she found Abraham sitting on an overturned crate near the stall, reading a small leather-bound book by the light of a lantern he had hung from a nail in the post. He looked up when she came in, and there was a fraction of a second in which she caught him before he reassembled whatever arrangement he customarily presented to the world, and what she caught was a man who was, very quietly, content. It vanished almost instantly. The careful neutral expression returned, but she had seen it. "What are you reading?" she asked, going past him to the limping cow's stall. A pause, then, "Marcus Aurelius." She stopped moving and looked at him over the stall door. "The Roman emperor, the philosopher," he said. "He was also an emperor, but that is not what matters about him." "A trail boss who reads Marcus Aurelius," she said. "A seamstress who reads land deeds and ranch accounts," he returned, and there was something in his voice that was not quite a smile but was the sound of what a smile would be if it were expressed in words. She looked at him a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "What does Marcus Aurelius say?" she asked. Abraham looked down at the small book. "He says that what we do now echoes in eternity, a beat of silence. He also says that it is not the thing itself that disturbs us but our judgment about the thing." "I am not disturbed," Gertrude said, returning her attention to the cow's hoof. "No," Abraham said with that same tone, "you are not." The cow's hoof had a small stone lodged near the frog, which Gertrude removed with the pick that hung on the post, and when she came out of the stall she found that Abraham had put the book away and was holding the lantern for her, because the main barn light did not reach well into the stall corners, and the gesture was so quiet and practical and kind that she did not know what to do with it. "Thank you," she said. "Of course," he said. They walked back to the house in the cold November dark, not touching, not speaking, with approximately 12 inches of charged air between them that felt like considerably less. December arrived with a brutality that surprised even Abraham, who had wintered in Nevada before. 3 days of hard freeze at the start of the month that iced the water troughs and sent the cattle into miserable, pressing huddles near the windbreak of juniper on the southern fence line. Abraham and Delbert and Roy worked dawn to dusk, keeping the troughs broken and the feed adequate, and Gertrude spent the days in the kitchen producing enormous quantities of food and coffee and soup that she brought out to them in the mid-afternoon, because a man working in that cold needed fuel, and she was not going to be the person who did not provide it. It was on the second day of the hard freeze that she discovered the letter. She had gone into the bunkhouse to leave a covered pot of soup on the table, a habit she had established, and she had set it down and turned to go, and her eye had caught a piece of paper on Abraham's cot that she had not meant to look at and looked at anyway. It was from Mr. Theodore Payne, the lawyer in Carson City. It was dated October the 2nd, 2 days before Abraham arrived at the Beckett flat. She should not have read it. She read every word. The letter confirmed Abraham's account of the arrangement in most particulars, but contained one significant additional detail. Payne had written that Denton Cross had already made an offer to purchase the Beckett flat from the heir, one Gertrude Beckett, and that she had not yet responded to the offer, and that in Payne's professional opinion the offer was inadequate, and that the land was worth considerably more than Cross was willing to pay, particularly if the cattle could be brought to market in good condition in the spring, which was why Payne had reached out to Wallace about the possibility of an arrangement. This part she had known. What she had not known was the final paragraph. Payne had written that he should mention, for Wallace's full information, that Cross had asked Payne to identify who might be sent to the Beckett flat to assess the property's condition, and that Payne had, before understanding Cross's intention, mentioned Wallace's name as a possible candidate for ranch management. Payne was writing now to inform Wallace of this, and to note that Cross might therefore be aware of Wallace's involvement and might regard him as an obstacle. Hidden motive. Cross had known about Abraham from the beginning. Gertrude put the letter back exactly as she had found it. She went back to the house and stood at the kitchen window looking at the frozen ground and the gray sky, and she thought about secrets and about the difference between a man who was hiding something and a man who simply had not yet found the moment to say it, because the letter did not reveal any deception on Abraham's part. Payne had told Abraham about Cross's possible awareness. Abraham had not told her. Why? She turned this over in her mind for the rest of the afternoon and into the evening, and when Abraham came in from the cold, face red and hands stiff despite the heavy gloves, and sat down at the kitchen table and wrapped both hands around the coffee cup she set in front of him with that focused, wordless appreciation she had come to know, she looked at him and said, "Does Denton Cross know you are here?" He looked up from the coffee. The gray eyes were very still. "Payne thinks he might," Abraham said. "I was going to tell you, when I was certain. I did not want to alarm you about a possibility. That is my risk to assess," she said quietly, "not yours to manage." He set the coffee cup down and looked at her directly in the way he had, that careful analytical attention that she had stopped finding infuriating weeks ago and had started finding something else entirely. "You are right," he said. "I should have told you immediately." She had expected justification. She had expected the long explanation that men typically deployed when they had made a choice on a woman's behalf. The absence of it was so complete that she did not know where to put the argument she had assembled. "I am not angry," she said, eventually. "You are some kind of angry," he said. "I am frustrated that information relevant to my safety was withheld," she said precisely. "I am less angry about the reason, which I think was probably not malicious." "It was not," he said. "It was a miscalculation. I thought I was protecting you. I understand now that what you need is accurate information, not protection from it." Nobody had ever said a thing like that to her, not with that particular combination of directness and acknowledgement. She sat down across from him at the kitchen table, and they looked at each other for a moment that stretched in a way that made the cold outside seem very distant. "Tell me what you think Cross will do," she said. He told her. He laid it out with the same efficient precision he brought to cattle work, the assessment clean and unsentimental. Cross would watch. He would wait to see if the debt could be paid, and if it became clear that it could, he would accelerate pressure. He would probably send men to assess the property. He might make more offers. If the herd was in good enough condition by spring, they could potentially bring between $1,200 and $1,500 at the Winnemucca cattle market, which, combined with whatever she could raise by selling the secondary equipment and perhaps the eastern parcels of land that were too rocky for grazing anyway, might cover the debt. Might. The margin was tight. There was no version of it that was comfortable, but there was a version of it that worked. "I need you to understand that I am going to do whatever is necessary," Gertrude said. "I know," he said. "I am not saying it to be dramatic. I am saying it so that you understand the parameters you are working within." He looked at her steadily. "I know," he said again, and the repetition was different from the first time, heavier, with something underneath it she could not fully see. "I worked that out about you around the end of the first week." She went to bed that night with that sentence sitting in her chest like an ember, around the end of the first week. He had been watching her that carefully, that early. Christmas came and went with minimal ceremony. A modest dinner she prepared and they ate together, the two of them and Delbert and Roy, at the kitchen table with a bottle of rye whiskey that Abraham produced from somewhere, and a silence that was easy and full rather than empty and awkward. Delbert and Roy went to Palisade for the holiday and came back the next morning with mild headaches and good humor, and work resumed, and January arrived with its relentless counting down. It was on the 5th of January that Cross made his move. He rode out to the Beckett flat himself, which surprised her. She had expected to deal with intermediaries. Instead, it was Cross himself, a heavy-set man of perhaps 50 with a neatly trimmed beard and the careful, pleasantly arranged face of a man who was accustomed to being underestimated by the people he intended to destroy. He had two men with him, both riding a bit back, and they stayed with the horses while Cross came to the porch where Gertrude was standing. Abraham was in the near pasture. She could see him at the fence line, distant but present, and she had the impression that he could also see her. Cross removed his hat. "Miss Beckett, Denton Cross, I believe we have corresponded." "Mr. Cross," she said, "I know who you are. Then you know why I am here." "The debt is not due until the 15th, she said. "I am aware of the date." Cross smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind assembled from long experience of situations in which smiling was strategically useful. "I have a new offer I believe you will find generous, given the circumstances," he said. "I am prepared to purchase the property, deed and all, for $1,500 clear of the debt. You would walk away with the $1,500, no obligation, no January deadline." $1,500, when the debt was $2,040. He was offering her $1,500 to take her land and cancel the debt he himself held, which meant he would be acquiring the property for effectively nothing while appearing to pay for it. "No," Gertrude said. Cross's smile became marginally less practiced. "I would encourage you to consider carefully. The herd is not in a condition that will command strong prices in the spring market." "The herd is in considerably better condition than it was in October," she said, "and improving." "I have heard you have engaged a hand," Cross said. His eyes moved briefly toward the far pasture, toward the distant figure of Abraham at the fence line, and then back to her. "Abraham Wallace." "I have," she said. "Mr. Wallace has a reputation," Cross said, "for being difficult when he believes himself to be on the right side of a thing." "I would expect nothing less," Gertrude said. Cross looked at her for a moment with something that was not yet a threat but was the country just adjacent to one. "The offer stands until the 12th, he said. "I hope you will think about it." He replaced his hat, nodded with that practiced pleasantness, and went back to his horse. She watched him ride out down the eastern track, and then turned and went inside and stood at the kitchen window, and waited until the shaking in her hand stopped. Abraham came in from the pasture at the usual time, and she told him every word of the exchange, and he listened without interruption, standing at the kitchen door with his coat still on. When she finished, he said, "He brought 2 men. Yes, that is not a social call. That is him establishing that he has resources and is willing to use them." "I understood that," she said. He looked at her. "Are you frightened?" She considered the honest answer. "Yes," she said. "But being frightened has never stopped me from doing what needed doing." Something moved through his expression that she had not seen before. Not admiration exactly, though it might have contained that. Something more personal than admiration. Something that looked briefly and unmistakably like a man recognizing something he had been looking for without knowing he was looking. It was gone very quickly. "All right," he said, and took his coat off and sat down at the table. In the week that followed the visit from Cross, Abraham changed his habits. He stayed closer to the main buildings. He spoke quietly to Delbert and Roy about what to watch for and what to report. He began sleeping in the barn rather than the bunkhouse, a change he mentioned to her in passing without explanation, but the explanation was obvious enough. The barn held the remaining horses and the equipment, and was the most vulnerable structure on the property to sabotage, and its vulnerability was why someone needed to be in it at night. Gertrude understood this. What she had not fully processed was that it also meant Abraham Wallace was not sleeping in the bunkhouse anymore, and the distance between where he now slept and where she slept was approximately 40 yards. She was not sure why this was something her mind kept returning to. She was actually quite sure why. She was simply exercising her established habit of not examining it directly. The 8th of January produced a development she had not anticipated. A letter arrived from Mr. Payne in Carson City informing her that he had located a potential buyer for the eastern parcel of the Beckett Flat, approximately 300 acres of rocky ground that was essentially useless for cattle, at a price of $650. If she was willing to sell the parcel, and if the spring cattle sale came in at the lower end of Abraham's estimate of $1,200, she would be $410 short of the debt. $410. She took the letter out to the barn where Abraham was working and showed it to him. He read it standing up, as he always did, one hand holding the paper and the other resting on the fence post, and she watched his face do its careful mathematical work. "The parcel sale gives you $650, he said. "If we push hard, if we sell all the cattle we can afford to sell and keep the breeding stock, we can potentially reach $1,400 at market." "That is still $10 short at best," she said. $10 is not nothing, he said. "No," she agreed. "But it is also not 2,040. He looked at the letter again. Then he folded it carefully and handed it back to her, and he looked at her with those steady gray eyes, and he said, "I have some money set aside." She went very still. "No," she said. "It is not an offer," he said. "It is a statement of fact. If we are $400 short, there is a solution." "That is your money," she said. "You have no obligation." "I am not talking about obligation," he said, and his voice had something in it that she was not ready to hear, and so she simply did not hear it and responded instead to the practical surface of the thing. "I will not take your savings to pay a debt on my property," she said. "That is not negotiable." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "All right, but keep it in mind." She kept it in mind. She also kept in mind the fact that he had offered it, which meant something she was not ready to name. The 10th of January was when Denton Cross stopped being merely a problem and became a genuine danger. It happened at night. Gertrude was asleep in the main house when she was woken by the sound that all ranchers knew and feared above almost everything else, the particular crackling hiss of fire that was moving faster than it should, the smell of smoke that was too sharp and too sudden to be a natural accident. She was at the window in seconds. The eastern fence line of the south pasture was burning. Not just burning in a line, the way fire burns when it has been encouraged, when oil or kerosene has been applied in a strip and then ignited. The cattle were moving in the pasture, not panicking yet but agitated, and she could see in the moonlight the shapes of Delbert and Roy coming out of the bunkhouse at a run. She was dressed and outside in less than 2 minutes. Abraham was already at the fence line. She did not know how he had gotten there so fast from the barn, but he was there, directing Delbert and Roy with the efficient calm of a man who had dealt with emergencies before, and had learned not to let the emergency dictate his tempo. They had the fence fire under control in 40 minutes, stamping and beating the dried grass on the near side of the fence line, keeping the cattle moving away from the heat, working in the cold night air with their faces red from the heat and their hands black. When it was out, Abraham turned and looked at her in the darkness. "That was set," she said. "Yes," he said, "Cross. Or someone Cross paid." He paused. "This is an escalation." "I know," she said. "He is telling you that he can make things worse than a debt deadline." She looked at the blackened fence line, at the cattle settling slowly back into nervous calm, at the stars above the Nevada desert that were entirely indifferent to all of it. "He can try," she said. Abraham looked at her for a long moment in the aftermath of the fire. His face was lit by the dying embers, and his expression had that quality again, the one she had been watching approach for weeks like a storm that the weather was promising, the one she could not let herself name because naming it felt like the kind of dangerous thing that happened to other people in other lives. "Gertrude," he said. "Do not," she said. He stopped. They stood in the cold dark for a moment that was very full. "All right," he said finally, and went back to checking the fence. On the 11th of January, Cross sent another man with another letter, and the letter was no longer pleasantly worded. It said that the offer of $1,500 was now rescinded, and that the full debt of $2,040 would be due on the 15th as agreed, and that he looked forward to taking possession of the property on the 16th if the debt was not cleared. Gertrude read it and burned it in the kitchen stove. She was at the kitchen table that evening, not sleeping because sleeping was not possible, working through the numbers for the 100th time, when Abraham came in from the barn. She had not expected him. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her and then came in and sat down across from her at the table and said nothing. She pushed the account book toward him. He looked at the numbers, at the columns she had gone over and over, at the margins she had calculated and recalculated. He looked at them for a long time. Then he said, "I have $420. Abraham." "It is not charity," he said. "It is an investment. 20% of the herd has been our agreed arrangement. If you want to change that arrangement to reflect this additional investment, we can do that. Or you can keep the 20% and consider the 400 alone to be repaid from the spring proceeds. You would trust me to repay it?" He looked at her across the table. "Yes," he said simply. She looked down at the account book. She looked at the numbers that were so close and yet so insufficient. She looked at the months of work she had put into this, the cold mornings and the fence repairs and the bone-deep fatigue of doing something you had never been trained for because it needed doing. She looked back up at him. "A loan," she said, "to be repaid from the spring proceeds with interest." "No interest," he said. "Interest," she said firmly. The corners of his eyes did the thing that was the closest he came to smiling, the slight deepening of the lines there that suggested something was happening in the territory behind the expression. "Fine," he said. 5%. 5%, she agreed. She did not sleep well that night, but for a different reason than the debt. The morning of the 13th brought Denton Cross back, and this time he did not come to the porch. He came with 4 men, not the 2 men from before. 4 men, and they did not stay back with the horses. They rode into the yard with the particular loose arrangement of men who had been told that today was the day things were going to be different. Gertrude had the Smith & Wesson in her pocket. She had put it there when she saw them coming from the kitchen window, moving through the house quickly, and she had gone to the barn to find Abraham before they reached the yard. He had seen them already. He was standing at the barn door. "4," she said. "I see them," he said. "Can we send for the marshal? Palisade is 11 miles. By the time someone rode for the marshal and the marshal rode back, they would be gone, and so would our leverage." He looked at her. "I need you to go into the barn." "I am not going into the barn, Gertrude." "I am not going into the barn," she said again steadily. "This is my property. I am standing on it." Looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the 4 men and Cross who had pulled up in the yard. "Stay behind me," he said. They went out together. Cross looked at both of them with an expression that had dropped all the pleasant arrangement and was now simply what it had always been underneath it. "Miss Beckett," he said, "I told you that the offer was rescinded. I am prepared to enforce the debt on the 15th. "The debt is not due until the 15th, Gertrude said. "It is the 13th. "We are here to discuss terms," Cross said. "There are no terms to discuss," she said. "The debt will be paid on the 15th. Cross's eyes moved to Abraham. "Wallace," he said, "you are a sensible man. You know when a situation is not worth the complication. You could walk away from this and find work elsewhere. There is no reason for you to be involved in a property dispute." "It stopped being just a property dispute when you burned her fence line," Abraham said. The pleasantness was entirely gone from Cross's face now. He made a small gesture, not obvious, but one of the men behind him dismounted. Then another. That was when things moved very quickly. Cross had not been the one to move on Abraham, not directly. One of his men had gotten behind Abraham while Cross was talking, which was why Gertrude had not seen it coming in time. And by the time she registered the movement, the man had the Remington army at Abraham's temple, and 2 more of Cross's men were between Gertrude and the barn door, and the whole situation had become something entirely different from a negotiation. Cross looked satisfied. "You will sign the property over to me today," he said to Gertrude. "I will consider the debt settled." Gertrude looked at the gun at Abraham's head. She looked at Abraham. He was looking at her. "Get out of the barn, Gertrude," he said. She was not in the barn. They were in the yard. He meant the property. He meant get out of this situation by giving Cross what he wanted, and she understood that. And she understood that he was saying it because a gun at his head was a form of leverage she had not anticipated, and he was trying to give her an exit. She was not taking the exit. "I did not plan on caring about any of this," Abraham said quietly, and she understood, looking at him, that he was not talking about the land. "And here I am caring deeply." The barn was on fire. She had missed it in the intensity of the yard, but the eastern wall of the barn was smoking, the canvas on the outer wall beginning to catch, And the realization arrived in her mind with a terrible clarity. Cross had sent one of his men to set the barn while the attention was on the yard. He was burning her options in real time. Gertrude Beckett looked at Denton Cross. Then she reached into her pocket. The .32 caliber Smith & Wesson was small. It was not a weapon designed for extended gunfights. It was a weapon designed for close range and specific purpose, and at 6 feet from Denton Cross it was entirely adequate. She did not aim at Cross. She aimed at the man with the gun at Abraham's head, and she said very clearly, "Put the gun down or I will shoot you, and then I will shoot him. And then I will pay the debt on the 15th, and I will have the marshal out here on the 16th, and you will explain to a court what your men were doing on my property." Complete silence. The man with the Remington looked at Cross. Cross looked at Gertrude. Gertrude looked at Cross with the focused, absolute certainty of a woman who had calculated her situation down to its last dollar and its last contingency and was done being managed. Cross made the calculation. She could see him doing it. 4 men against 1 woman, except the woman had a gun and a very clear aim and the look on her face that suggested she had arrived at a place beyond fear and was operating in the country past it, which was the most dangerous kind of person to negotiate with. "This is not over," Cross said. "No," she agreed. "It is not. It is over on the 15th when the debt is paid. Until then, get off my land." They left. The man with the Remington lowered it slowly, and Abraham did not move until the gun was pointed at the ground, and then he moved very quickly, putting himself between Gertrude and Cross's retreating men with a speed and certainty that was protective without being theatrical. The barn. They ran for it together. The fire had caught on the eastern wall but had not reached the interior, and Delbert and Roy were already there with buckets from the well, and they got it out in 20 minutes of hard work, and when it was out they stood in the cold January air breathing hard and looking at the smoke stains on the barn wall. Abraham turned to her. She turned to him. Something was happening in his expression that was entirely unfamiliar and entirely recognizable at the same time. It was the expression of a man who had spent a very long time successfully not feeling certain things, and had just failed completely and irrevocably, and was aware of it. "You are going to get yourself killed," he said, and his voice had that quality that she had first heard him use 2 weeks ago in the aftermath of the fence fire, the quality that was pressing against the careful neutral surface from underneath. "I am not," she said. "You aimed that gun." "I aimed it accurately," she said. "I grew up shooting. My father taught me. I knew exactly what I was doing." He looked at her for a long moment. The gray eyes were not neutral at all. They were very far from neutral. They were, in fact, the opposite of neutral, which was a condition she had not seen in them, and which was doing something significant to her ability to breathe normally. "Gertrude," he said. "Yes," she said. "I said something when that gun was at my head." "I heard you." He was very still. "I meant the land," he said carefully. "I meant the ranch and the cattle and the work." "I know," she said. A pause, long enough that she could hear the horses in the pasture and the last of the fire hissing out in the wet wood and the wind in the junipers. "I also did not mean the land," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The careful neutral surface that had been his characteristic expression from the first day she had seen him from the roof was entirely gone, and what was underneath it was not what she had expected, which was to say it was not anything she could have named before this moment. But now that she could see it, she recognized it completely. "I know that too," she said. He crossed the 4 feet between them in one step, and she did not move away. He put his hand on the side of her face, which was cold from the January air and which she was fairly sure she could feel down to her spine, and he looked at her with the gray eyes that were no longer analytical but were simply present, entirely present, with no part of him held back. "I did not come here to feel any of this," he said. "I did not invite you to feel it," she said. "You arrived on your own." "Yes," he said. "I did." He kissed her in the yard of the Beckett flat in the smoke and cold of January the 13th, 1875, with the smell of extinguished fire around them and the cattle moving in the pasture and the Nevada sky enormous and pale above them. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had made a decision and was executing it with the same committed thoroughness he brought to everything else. She kissed him back. They stood in the cold yard for a very long time. When they separated, she became aware that Delbert and Roy were both looking at them from opposite ends of the barn, with the studied non-expressions of men who were pretending very hard to have noticed nothing at all. "The cattle need checking," Abraham said, with a return of composure that was slightly undermined by the fact that his hand was still on her face. "They do," she agreed. He lowered his hand. He looked at her one more time. "We are going to discuss the rest of this," he said, "later, when the debt is settled." "Yes," she said, "we are." She went back to the house. She sat at the kitchen table and pressed her hands flat on the account book and stared at nothing for approximately 3 minutes, which was the time it took her to reassemble herself into a functional person. Then she picked up the pen and went back to the numbers. The 14th of January was spent in feverish preparation. The parcel sale had been arranged with Payne through correspondence, and the $650 was waiting for her in the form of a bank draft in Carson City, which required her to ride into Palisade and use the telegraph and the banking services of the local agent who operated under a Carson City charter. Abraham accompanied her, riding alongside on the blue roan while she rode Edgar with somewhat more dignity than usual, and they conducted the banking transaction and sent the confirmation to Payne and received their draft confirmation in return. And they rode back to the Beckett flat in the late afternoon with the draft in her coat pocket and $420 of Abraham's money in her other pocket, and the knowledge that they could pay the debt in the morning. They did not talk much on the ride back. It was a companionable silence, the kind of silence that has something warm at the center of it. The 15th of January, Gertrude Beckett rode into Palisade with Abraham at her side and presented the payment for the debt at the office of the local land agent who held the debt instrument on Cross's behalf. $2,040. Exact. The agent was a thin man named Harmon who looked pained by the entire situation and was clearly someone who had expected to be transferring a deed today rather than marking a debt as satisfied. He counted the money twice, wrote the discharge, signed it, and handed her the copy with the air of a man who had lost a significant thing and was attempting not to let it show. She folded the discharge and put it in her coat pocket. Abraham held the door for her as they walked out into the January sun. Outside on the wooden sidewalk, she stopped and turned to him, and she looked at his face in the winter light. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he agreed. "I want to say something to you," she said. "All right," he said. "You offered me your savings without any certainty of return. You worked this property for 3 months at 20% on a herd that might not have sold. You slept in the barn to protect my horses. You put yourself between me and 4 armed men." She paused. "I want to be clear that I see those things clearly and I do not take them lightly." He looked at her steadily. "I was not doing it for credit," he said. "I know," she said. "That is precisely what I am saying." They stood on the sidewalk in Palisade, Nevada on the 15th of January, 1875, and the winter sun was doing something interesting with the light on the mountains to the west, and Abraham Wallace looked at Gertrude Beckett with no part of himself held back at all. "I said we would discuss the rest of it when the debt was settled," he said. "You did," she said. "The debt is settled." "It is," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Abraham Wallace, who chose his words with the precision of a man who had learned that careless words had consequences, looked at her with the gray eyes that were entirely open. "I have not let myself want anything particular in a long time," he said. "I mean a specific thing, a specific life. I have been very good at wanting only what was in front of me, the next drive, the next season, the next town. I found it simpler." He paused. "You are the first particular thing I have wanted in about 8 years. She absorbed this. "That is a significant statement," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not an easy person," she said. "I have been told this multiple times, including by people who were trying to be kind." "I know," he said again, and the slight deepening of the lines at the corners of his eyes was more pronounced than usual. I have been watching you for 3 months. I am aware of the exact nature of your difficulty, and I find it entirely compatible with the exact nature of mine. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, Abraham. Yes, he said. I want a specific life too. He looked at her with something that was not the careful, neutral expression, and was not the open, unguarded expression she had seen in the yard after the kiss. It was a third thing, quieter than either, more settled, the expression of a man arriving somewhere. Good, he said. They rode back to the Beckett flat in the January afternoon, with the debt discharge in her pocket and the cold air bright and clear around them. And the mountains caught the last of the day's light as they came in on the eastern track, and Edgar maintained his deep suspicion of Abraham's blue roan with admirable consistency. And the Beckett flat sat in its shallow basin looking exactly as it had always looked, damaged and functional and entirely, stubbornly there. In February, Denton Cross made one more attempt. He filed a counter-challenge with the county land office, claiming that the parcel sale had violated a term in the original debt instrument that prevented sale of any portion of the property prior to debt settlement without his approval. The challenge was meritless, as Mr. Payne confirmed in a sharp letter from Carson City, because the term Cross was citing referred to sale that reduced the collateral value below the debt amount, which the parcel sale had not done because the remaining property value exceeded the remaining debt. The challenge was dismissed by the county land agent in March. Cross did not bother them again. Gertrude suspected that losing a property he had been certain of, and losing it to a woman who had arrived with a single trunk and a small revolver, and a borrowed trail boss, was enough of an indignity that he preferred to simply not revisit the experience. She did not waste energy being satisfied about this. There was too much work to do. February and March were the hard months of preparation. Abraham pushed the herd with a focus and energy that Gertrude found astonishing to watch, bringing the cattle to a condition that even Delbert and Roy, who were not prone to enthusiasm, described as remarkable. The longhorns that had been rangy and thin in October were in November and December's cold already better, and by March they were something a buyer would look at with genuine interest. The spring brought grass to the Beckett flat that surprised her. The basin that had seemed so arid and inhospitable in the fall turned out, under the snowmelt and the March rain, to produce a low, dense grass that the cattle worked through with methodical enthusiasm. She learned later from a neighboring rancher that the Beckett flat had always had this grass, but that her Uncle Aldous had never managed the grazing properly, had let the cattle work the same ground repeatedly until it was exhausted, and that with even a modest rotation, the grass recovered quickly. Abraham had known this. He had managed the rotation from the first week. It was one of the many things he had done without comment that she had not fully understood until the consequences of them arrived. She mentioned this to him one March evening when they were sitting on the repaired porch, which no longer listed to the left because Abraham had fixed the foundation supports in early February. You knew the grass would come back, she said. I thought it would, he said. Basin grass usually does, but I was not certain. You never mentioned it. You had enough to worry about, he said. I did not want to add the possibility that I might be wrong about the pasture to the list. She looked at him. You are going to have to stop managing what information I receive, she said, but without the edge she would have had in October. He looked back at her with the slight deepening of the corner lines. You are going to have to accept that some things I do are not managing you, but simply trying not to trouble you unnecessarily. You can trust me with trouble. I know, he said. I am learning to do it differently than I have done before. Gertrude, I spent 8 years not having anyone in my life that it was worth protecting. I am recalibrating. She looked at the mountains in the last of the March light. Then she looked back at him. Recalibrate at a pace that keeps me informed, she said. Yes, ma'am, he said, and the warmth in it was so different from the careful, neutral way he had said those words in October that she had to look away at the mountains again. In April, she sold the herd. Abraham drove them to the Winnemucca market with Delbert and Roy, a 3-day drive that Gertrude did not accompany in the traditional sense, but which she prepared for with the meticulous attention to provision and logistics that she had applied to everything since October. She saw them off at dawn on a Tuesday, standing at the gate of the south pasture while the cattle moved out in the early light with that peculiar dignity of animals going somewhere they did not know about. Abraham stopped his blue roan at the gate and looked down at her. 3 days, he said. 3 days, she agreed. He looked at her for a moment with that settled, arriving quality that she had learned to recognize. Come back, he said. She waited. I would like to discuss the matter of whether this is a temporary arrangement, he said. She looked up at him in the April light. The cattle are going to be sold, she said. The terms of our arrangement were 20% of the cattle sale. Yes, he said. That would conclude the arrangement as originally stated, she said. Yes, he said again. And you want to discuss whether there is a different arrangement to follow. I do, he said. She looked at him steadily. Come back with what the herd brought, she said, and we will talk about arrangements. He rode out with the herd. She spent the 3 days he was gone in a state of activity that she recognized as a coping mechanism. She repaired the kitchen window frame that had needed attention for weeks. She reorganized the supply room. She wrote a long letter to Mr. Payne thanking him for his role in the proceedings. She lay awake at night listening to the wind in the junipers and the empty silence from the direction of the barn, and tried not to think too specifically about what she wanted the conversation about arrangements to contain. She was mostly unsuccessful at not thinking about it. He came back on the 4th day, which was 1 day later than planned, and for several hours on the afternoon of the 4th day, she stood at the kitchen window with her stomach in an arrangement she did not care for, and then she heard horses on the eastern track and went to the porch. He had brought $1,860. The herd had come in at the high end of his estimate because the condition of the cattle had surprised the buyers, who had expected the Beckett flat longhorns to be the underfed specimens their reputation suggested, and instead found animals in excellent condition at a time of year when that was not common. He handed her the money at the porch steps. She counted it. Then she counted out his 20%, which was $372, and handed it back to him. Then she counted out $420 with the 5% interest of $21 added, which was $441, and handed that to him also. He looked at the money in his hands. You are giving me $813. $813, she confirmed. That is accurate, he said. It is, she said. He looked up from the money to her face. Gertrude, you said you wanted to discuss arrangements, she said. I think we should discuss them inside, because it is April and it is still cold and I would like coffee. They went inside. She made the coffee. He sat at the kitchen table, which was where all their significant conversations had happened, as if the kitchen table had become, over the months, the place where the truth between them lived. He set the money on the table and looked at it, and then at her when she set his coffee in front of him. The arrangement I want to discuss, he said, is not a cattle arrangement. No, she agreed. I want to stay, he said, at the Beckett flat, not as a hired hand, not on a percentage. I want to stay in a capacity that is not temporary and does not have terms that expire. She sat down across from him and wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at him. You want to stay, she said. I want to marry you, he said, with the directness that was entirely characteristic of him, and that she had come to recognize as his particular form of respect, the refusal to obscure a direct thing in soft language. If that is something you want. She looked at Abraham Wallace across the kitchen table of the Beckett flat on a cold April morning, with the mountains visible through the window and $1,800 on the table and 8 weeks of accumulated certainty sitting in her chest. I want that, she said. He looked at her for a moment. The gray eyes were entirely open. Good, he said, which was what he had said in January on the sidewalk in Palisade, and it meant the same thing it had meant then, which was the sound of a man arriving. They were married in Palisade in the last week of April, in the small white church on the main street, with the local minister officiating and Delbert and Roy serving as witnesses, and a small gathering of the neighboring ranchers and the Palisade townspeople who had watched the Beckett flat situation with considerable interest over the winter and were invested in the outcome. Gertrude wore a dress she had made herself, a deep blue wool that she had brought from Elko in her trunk with some vague and entirely unfounded notion that there might eventually be an occasion for it. Abraham wore his best coat and a shirt that was clearly new and had been acquired in Winnemucca during the cattle drive, which she only learned about afterwards when he mentioned in passing that he had stopped at the dry goods store while Roy and Delbert were settling the cattle, and she found this detail so specific and so quietly intentional that it settled something in her chest that had not been fully settled even yet. The minister said the words. They said the words back to him. Abraham's hand was warm around hers, and when the minister said they were married, he looked at her with the gray eyes that were entirely and irrevocably open, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that this was the first time in her adult life that she was not standing alone in something. It was a better feeling than she had expected. They were not people given to grand gestures. The celebration after the ceremony was modest and warm, with the neighboring ranchers bringing food and the proprietor of the Palisade Saloon sending over a bottle of good whiskey as a gift. And Delbert played a fiddle with unexpected competence. And the late April evening was cold but clear. And at some point in the proceedings Abraham was at her side with his arm around her shoulders in a way that felt so natural that she could not have said exactly when it had happened. Only that it was there and that it was right. That summer they worked. There was no honeymoon in the romantic novel sense. There was the Beckett flat, which still needed extensive repair and management, and there was the cattle that remained, the breeding stock she had held back from the spring sale, and there was the question of what the ranch would be going forward, not a failing remnant of a man who had not cared for it, but a functioning property in its own right. Abraham was a different person to work alongside as a husband than he had been as a hired hand, not in the quality of his work or the direction of his energy, but in the way he included her. He consulted her on decisions that he had previously made independently. He explained his reasoning when he chose one approach over another. He asked her opinion with the genuine expectation that her opinion would contain information he wanted. It was, she thought, the most thorough form of respect she had ever experienced, the kind that was operational rather than merely expressed. She consulted him on the accounts and the planning and the long-term questions of what the land could sustainably carry and what improvements were worth making, and in what order. He brought to those discussions an attention to detail and a patience with complexity that matched her own. And they had conversations over the kitchen table in the evenings that went on longer than the day's business required, because they were also interesting. She had not expected to find her husband interesting, not in that ongoing, inexhaustible way. She had expected to find him reliable and present, which he was, but the reliable and present came with a quality of mind that continually offered her something new to think about, a reference she had not heard before, a way of looking at a problem from an angle she had not considered. He read constantly. Whenever there was an unoccupied hour, he was reading, and the books he obtained in Winnemucca and Elko were a remarkable variety of things, history and philosophy and natural science, and occasionally, when he thought she was not paying particular attention, a volume of poetry. She absolutely paid attention. In June, she found him reading Whitman on the porch in the evening, and she sat in the chair beside him and asked him to read aloud, and he gave her a sideways look that she had come to recognize as the equivalent, in his personal vocabulary, of being caught doing something slightly vulnerable. And then he read aloud in his quiet voice, while the summer evening settled over the basin and the cattle in the far pasture were dark shapes against the grass, and the sky went from blue to gold to the first colors of sunset. It was, she thought, the most pleasant evening she could remember. That autumn, in October, exactly 1 year after she had first seen him riding up the eastern track on the Blue Roan, she told him she was going to have a child. She had been fairly certain for about 2 weeks and absolutely certain for 3 days, and she had chosen the evening of the 5th of October, a Tuesday, to tell him, which was not a calculated choice, but was the particular evening when he came in from checking the fence line and sat down at the kitchen table and looked at her with those steady gray eyes, and she simply could not hold on to the information for another moment. He was very still when she said it. Then something happened in his face that she had not seen before and would not forget. It was not the careful neutral expression. It was not the open expression she had seen in the yard after the fire. It was something deeper than either of those, something that looked like a man encountering a thing he had given up expecting and finding it present and real in front of him. He reached across the kitchen table and took her hand. He held it for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "Thank you." She looked at him. "For what?" "For being here," he said. "For staying, for all of it." She turned her hand over and held his hand properly. "You are not going to make this very hard, are you?" she said. The lines at the corners of his eyes deepened substantially. "Not today," he said. "Today I am going to be entirely uncomplicated." She laughed. She could not help it. And Abraham Wallace, who had come to the Beckett flat as a man who did not smile, smiled. The child was born on the 18th of June, 1876, in the main house of the Beckett flat, attended by the midwife from Palisade who had attended half the births in the county and did not believe in unnecessary drama. The birth was, by the midwife's accounting, completely uneventful. By Gertrude's accounting, it was the most significant event that had ever occurred in the history of the universe, which the midwife took in stride. The baby was a boy. He was large and red-faced and entirely healthy, and he regarded the world from his first moments with an expression of alert suspicion that Abraham said was entirely his mother's and Gertrude said was entirely his father's. And the argument, conducted with warmth and considerable amusement, was never satisfactorily resolved. They named him Thomas Aldous Wallace, Thomas for the simple reason that they both liked it. Aldous for the uncle who had, in his own difficult and indirect way, given her the Beckett flat, which had given her everything else. Abraham held his son on the evening of the day he was born, sitting in the chair by the bedroom window with Thomas in the crook of his arm, and the look on his face was the arriving expression, the settled, complete expression, but deeper than she had ever seen it and absolutely permanent. "You said you did not plan on caring about any of this," she said from the bed. He looked up at her. His eyes were very bright. "I said that when a gun was at my head," he said. "Yes," she said, "and you cared anyway." "Yes," he said, "I did." He looked back down at Thomas, who was asleep with the thoroughness only newborns achieved. "I am glad I did not manage it the way I intended to," he said quietly. "What did you intend?" she asked. "To do the work, take the 20%, move on to the next drive." He looked up at her again, and the gray eyes were entirely present, with no strategy or restraint in them at all. "I had been very successfully not staying anywhere for a long time. I had it down to a method." "I ruined your method," she said. "Thoroughly," he said. "I regret nothing," she said. "Neither do I," he said, and looked back at his son with the expression of a man who has arrived, completely and irrevocably, at the life he was meant to be living. Thomas grew into a child with his mother's precision and his father's patience, a combination that was either very useful or very alarming depending on the situation. He walked early and talked early and had opinions early, and from about the age of 2 had a particular habit of following Abraham around the ranch with the fixed attention of a small person determined to understand how things worked. Abraham taught him. He taught him the way he did everything, with thoroughness and without condescension, explaining the purpose of each thing as they did it, treating the child's questions as reasonable inquiries deserving complete answers. Gertrude would watch them from the kitchen window, the man and the small boy at the fence or the water trough or the horse paddock, and feel something in her chest that had no adequate name but was very large. In 1878, when Thomas was 2, she told Abraham she was going to have another child. This time he did not go still. He looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight and he smiled, the full, complete smile that had taken months to emerge but was, once it had arrived, devastatingly effective at dismantling any composure she had assembled. "Good," he said. "You keep saying that," she said. "It keeps being true," he said. The second child was also a boy, born in March of 1879. They named him James Henry Wallace. James was broad-shouldered and loud, and immediately began working on the project of determining who was in charge, a project that engaged his full attention for approximately the first 4 years of his life before he arrived at acceptable terms. The Beckett flat grew in those years. Not dramatically, not in the way of the large cattle operations that were expanding through Nevada in the 1870s and 1880s, but steadily, in the particular way of a property that was properly managed and carefully maintained and deeply cared about by the people who lived on it. Abraham was known in Elko County, by then, as a man who could be trusted, which in the ranching community of the 1870s was not a small reputation. He sat on the Palisade Town Council for 3 years, not because he sought the position, but because the community asked him, and he was constitutionally unable to say no to something reasonable that needed doing. Gertrude continued to be the force behind the Beckett Flats accounts and planning and practical intelligence, and she was known in her own right as a woman who understood land and cattle and the mathematics of survival in the Nevada high desert, which was a reputation she had not sought and was entirely comfortable with. She had not stopped sewing, either. She made the clothes for her family with the same precise attention she had brought to it in Elko, and there were occasionally neighbors or townspeople who asked her to make things, and she did when she had time, because she found the work satisfying in a way that was entirely distinct from the ranch work, and that served a different need. By 1880 she was 32 years old. She had a working cattle ranch, a sound deed free of debt, a husband who read to her from Marcus Aurelius in the evenings when the boys were in bed, and who could still, in a certain light, after all this time, make her entirely forget the thing she was thinking about with a single direct look. She had a life that was specific and demanding and entirely hers in the fullest sense of the word. She had not planned any of it. On an October evening in 1880, exactly 6 years after Abraham Wallace had ridden up the eastern track on his blue roan mare, and looked up at her from the base of a ladder, Gertrude sat on the repaired and solid porch of the Beckett flat with her husband, and the particular kind of quiet that comes when children have been got to bed, and the day's work is finished, and the evening is large and cool around you. The mountains to the west were doing what they always did with the last of the light, catching it and holding it in shades that no one had ever adequately described in paint or words, the Nevada mountain light that was particular to this basin and this hour. "I have been thinking," Gertrude said. "All right," Abraham said. "About what it would have been like if I had said no to the arrangement," she said. "In October," he said. "Yes, if I had decided I did not need a trail boss, or if I had taken Cross's offer, or if Mr. Payne had recommended someone else." Abraham was quiet for a moment. "I would have gone back to Winnemucca," he said, "found another drive, another season, and been entirely comfortable with that," she said. "I would have told myself so," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains. "Are you glad it went as it did?" she asked. He turned from the mountains and looked at her with the open, settled, arrived expression that was simply the permanent condition of his face now, not a thing he was performing or managing, but the natural state of a man who had stopped trying to want less than he wanted. "Yes," he said. He said it the way he said things that were beyond the need for further elaboration. She looked at the mountains. Then she said, "I am going to have another child." He went very still. Then he looked at her. "Gertrude." "I know," she said. "Thomas is 4, James is not yet 2. "I am not objecting," he said, and there was a quality in his voice that she recognized and that always made her feel on a cellular level, known in a way nothing else produced. "I know you are not," she said. "How are you?" "Well," she said honestly. "Tired, but well." He put his hand over hers on the armrest of the porch chair, his large warm hand over her smaller one, and they sat in the October evening with the mountains changing colors to the west, and the sound of the cattle in the far pasture, and the boys asleep inside, and the blue roan's distant companionable movement in the paddock. And it was so ordinary and so entirely, absolutely enough that Gertrude Beckett, who was not a person who cried easily or often, felt the particular bright burning behind her eyes that was not grief but its precise opposite. "Abraham," she said. "Yes," he said. "You said you did not plan on caring about any of this." "I did say that," he said. "You said it with a gun at your head and fire in the barn," she said. "Yes," he said. "And here you are," she said. He looked at her, and the gray eyes were entirely, irreversibly full. "Here I am," he said. "The third child was born in June of 1881 in the same room as the others, attended by the same midwife who had by now attended so many of Elko County's births that she moved through the process with the tranquil authority of someone who had seen all possible variations and was beyond surprise. The child was a girl. She arrived in the early morning, and the light in the room was the particular blue-white of Nevada dawn, and she was healthy and strong and had, unmistakably, her father's gray eyes. Abraham held her in the same chair by the bedroom window where he had held Thomas and James, and the look on his face was the look that was past all description, the look of a man who had spent years with iron where his heart had been and had been thoroughly and completely wrong about that. "What shall we call her?" Gertrude asked. He looked up from the baby. "You choose," he said. "Clara," she said. "Clara me." He looked at the girl in his arms. "Clara me Wallace," he said, as if testing the sound of it. "It suits her," Gertrude said. "It does," he agreed. Thomas and James were brought in to see their sister that morning, Thomas with the solemn interest of a 5-year-old who understood the gravity of the situation, James with the enthusiasm of a child who had not yet fully mapped the concept of gentle. The midwife intercepted James before he could demonstrate his appreciation too vigorously, and Abraham met his youngest son's exuberance with the patient firmness that had always worked on the cattle and worked equally well on 2-year-old boys. By evening the house was settled. The boys were in their room. Clara was asleep in the small cradle that had been Thomas's, and before that had been purchased in Winnemucca, on a trip that Abraham had made with an expression of studied practicality that had not fully concealed how much he had enjoyed choosing it. Abraham sat on the porch in the June evening, and Gertrude came out and sat beside him, moving carefully because she was tired but wanting the evening air and the mountains and the particular company of this man who had arrived on a Tuesday in October 1874 and had not left. "3 children," she said. "3 children," he agreed. "The ranch is sound," she said. "It is." "The debt is long gone," she said. "It is." "And here we are," she said. He looked at her with the gray eyes in the evening light. "Here we are," he said. They sat in the evening quiet for a long time, the Nevada desert spreading out around the Beckett flat in every direction, the mountains holding the last light, the June air carrying the smell of grass and dust and the faint sweetness of the sage. And inside the house 3 children were sleeping in the particular solid certainty of children who had never had reason to doubt that they would wake up to the same world they had left. Gertrude thought about the letter from Mr. Payne that had arrived when she was burning herself on the iron. She thought about the single trunk and the revolver and the $17 in a cracker tin. She thought about the roof and the ladder and the man on the blue roan who had looked up at her and asked if she was Gertrude Beckett, as though the answer was something he intended to keep. She thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere you had not planned to go and find that it was the only place that had ever made complete sense. She thought about the gun at Abraham's temple and the fire in the barn and the particular quality of his voice when he had said those words, quiet and certain in the middle of the most dangerous moment she had ever lived through, as if the danger was simply the place where the truth finally had no reason to stay hidden. I did not plan on caring about any of this, and here I am caring deeply. Abraham, she said. Yes, he said. I am very glad Mr. Payne wrote you a letter. He was quiet for a moment. Then, so am I am very glad you rode up my eastern track. I was glad of it myself, he said, about 4 days in when I had sufficiently recovered from the state of the roof. She laughed the full genuine laugh that she did not produce easily and that Abraham Wallace, when he produced it, regarded with an expression of open satisfaction that she found entirely disproportionate and entirely wonderful. The roof is fine now, she said. The roof is fine now, he agreed. The porch is fine. The kitchen window is fine. The bunkhouse is solid. The barn is sound. You fixed all of those things, she said. You let me, he said. She looked at him across the small space between the porch chairs. I did, she said. He looked back at her. The gray eyes in the last of the evening light were exactly as they had been on a cold January afternoon in the aftermath of fire, open and certain and entirely present. I intend to keep fixing things, he said. I intend to let you, she said. Clara cried briefly from inside the house and then settled, and a night bird called from somewhere in the junipers, and the mountains went dark, and the stars came out above the Beckett flat in their particular overwhelming Nevada abundance, and Abraham Wallace and Gertrude Beckett sat on the porch of the life they had built, not the life either of them had planned, but the one they had arrived at by way of a debt and a fire and a gun at a temple, and a quiet sentence spoken in the moment when all the careful distance was finally, irreversibly gone. Here I am, he had said. Here they were.